I teach thousands of people how to tune their cars, and talking with my students, a lot of times their questions will remind me of struggles or situations I went through when I was first getting started. In this video, I'm going to cover 15 different lessons that I had to learn the hard way so that you don't have to. I didn't really get into tuning by choice. I was sort of forced into it when my old boss quit coming to work one day. I always thought that tuning was cool and interesting, but I immediately wrote it off as something that I'd never be able to personally do, simply because back then I was completely computer illiterate, and truthfully, still to this day, I'm really not much of a computer guy. So the first lesson I learned the hard way was assuming that you needed to be a big computer nerd in order to be able to tune cars. And if I wouldn't have assumed that, I would have taken a much stronger interest in tuning way earlier than I did. And maybe I could have gotten some pointers from my old boss instead of just getting thrown into a situation where I had no choice but to learn how to tune cars with literally zero, and I mean zero, prior experience. I quickly came to realize that you don't need much computer knowledge at all in order to be able to successfully tune cars. Obviously, the more computer knowledge you have, the better, but the reality is that none of these tuning softwares are very resource heavy. So even inexpensive, low spec laptops can work just fine. And most softwares install the USB drivers and stuff for you when you download the software. So that's not nearly as big of a situation as it used to be. And file storage and organization is probably the biggest computer thing that you're going to need to learn outside of how to use, the basic keyboard and mouse and some, basic Windows commands that even my 7-year-old daughter knows how to do. So funny story, when I was in high school, we had to take a few computer programming type of classes, super entry level stuff. And I remember by the second or third day of class, I had already kind of mentally checked out. I had no idea what they were talking about. And I just honestly had zero interest in any of it at all. So a friend of mine basically helped me cheat my way through those classes. And now what feels like 100 years later, we're still friends. He has a Holley ECU in one of his cars that he runs questions by me sometimes. And anytime I have a computer related question, I usually reach out to him. So long story short, if you think you need to be Mr. Wizard on a computer in order to get started learning how to tune your own car, that's not the case at all. So don't let that hold you back like I let that hold me back. So this one still holds true to this day. Just in case you're unaware, it's probably best that you understand that tuning is 80% troubleshooting and maybe 20% actual tuning. And if you want to tune cars as a career, it seems that your troubleshooting skills are probably more important than your actual tuning skills. But what I've learned is that people don't seem to understand when they're first getting started, especially with their own cars, is that when something isn't doing what they want, they 100% of the time just assume that it's something in the tune itself or something that they're doing or not doing in the laptop. And they're just completely oblivious to the fact that there might be a problem with the actual car or the components under the hood. It's like once you're getting started, they're so wrapped up into the laptop that the thought of something else being wrong isn't even on the radar. So if you're new to all this and something isn't doing what you want it to do or what it should be doing, do yourself a favor and take a step back from the laptop and just start checking out the car itself before you drive yourself crazy. I had a customer years ago, before logging into people's computers remotely and being able to diagnose things that way was a thing. But anyways, I sent him a startup map so that he could get the car up and running and bring it to me to tune. And kind of out of nowhere, he called me up just being super rude and just really, really upset, I guess, because the car was running bad. So I asked him a bunch of questions, and he either didn't have an answer or told me that this was right, that was right. Kind of got to the point where I was like, I can't really help you much more over the phone. You got to get the car to me. He brings the car, and within 2 seconds of looking at the live data, I could see that his map sensor was wired wrong. And long story short, the car is reading 50 pounds of boost while it was idle. So obviously it was running super rich. So he swore to me that the car was 100% good to go and that the tune was the problem. I think that's why he was so upset, is in his eyes, everything was great. And I was the one that apparently ruined his life. He never did apologize to me for that, but we did get the car up and running, tuned, everything worked great. There is a 0% chance I would work with anybody who tried to talk to me like that nowadays, but it is what it is. So long story short, he thought the car was 100% good to go. Obviously lack of experience on this one, but you could have tried to send him 50,000 tune revisions and the car never ever would have ran right until he actually fixed the wiring problem with the map sensor. Everybody likes saving money, myself included, but one place you never want to cheap out out on is fuel injectors. Quality fuel injectors are one of the most important components in having a car that you enjoy driving versus a car that you hate. This one can bite you in the ass multiple different ways, especially if you're paying for tuning or paying for dyno time. The worst part about this one is sometimes you see people that'll buy a set of $3 injectors off of Craigslist and they'll have good luck with them. And then other people will spend decent amounts of money on injectors that they think are good, but they just in reality are not. The amount of time and more than likely money it costs to figure out that your injectors suck is never worth whatever amount of money that you saved. I've seen cars that have picture perfect air fuel ratios that just run like pure trash, which can make diagnosing the problem not very fun. Remember when I said that tuning is 80% troubleshooting? So long story short, make sure that you buy high quality fuel injectors and talk to real people to get feedback on if the injectors that you're eyeballing are any good or not. Don't assume because of the price that they're good. Sometimes you can buy expensive injectors that still aren't very good.
The price range, I can see me fucking up my checkbook too.
And surely just don't assume because the company's website makes them sound good and throws around a bunch of fancy terminology that they are good. At the end of the day, these websites are trying to get you to buy the injectors. So I would much rather talk with, if you're going to tune the car yourself, you might want to talk with other individuals and make sure people are having good luck with it. But if you're going to pay somebody to tune your car, talk to the person that you're going to have tune your car and see what injectors they prefer. That's probably going to be your safest route. So this one isn't as big of an issue today as it was many years ago, but this one cost me a ton of time, money, and frustration. I for sure had to learn this one the hard way, that not all widebands are created equal. Dynojet, Innovative, PLX, AEM, plus however many other options that I tried, all just seemed to suck equally as bad in their own ways. Eventually, I spent probably 2 or 3 times more than what kind of any of those cost on an FJO wideband, and it was night and day better. Then I decided to buy a Motec PLM at the price of about $3,500 at the time, which was absolutely insane. I remember it felt like I got kicked right in the nuts when I bought it. And it wasn't too long after buying that and seeing just how much better it was that I actually ended up buying a second one. Now, if you're just permanently installing a wideband in your car, you're not charging people for money for tuning and constantly taking the wideband in and out of cars, this likely isn't that much of a concern for you. But the amount of hours that I wasted by taking sensors in and out while a car's already strapped down on the dyno, troubleshooting why the air fuel just doesn't seem right, this, that, the other, damaging everything from just taking it in and out of hundreds of cars. And without a doubt, like replacing sensors nonstop was about the most frustrating thing in the world. And it felt like you were replacing sensor every handful of cars, just kind of eats into the money that you're making, kind of makes you feel like, what's the point of even doing this? And every single one of the problems that I had with all of these cheaper alternatives, they all went away when I finally decided to spend the money for the Motec wideband. It was absolutely worth every single penny. Luckily, there are some very, very good alternatives for a significantly less money now, but you kind of got to know which ones to get and which ones to stay away from. So I don't really use these much at all anymore because it seems every ECU has built-in wideband, but these are the Motec widebands that I've fallen in love with. Even though I don't use them, I can't really get rid of them. Everything's, got nice connectors and DR25, they're billet aluminum. Even these like suction cup mounts are awesome for using to take in and out of cars where you're not permanently mounting them. So it's hard to believe that $7,000 sitting there on the table, but worth every penny when you're using the stuff all day, every day. And on the subject of widebands, that kind of leads me into the next thing. There is no magic target air fuel ratio. When people are first getting started with tuning, one of the most common questions they tend to ask is, what air fuel ratio should I use? And the honest answer is that there is no magic target air fuel ratio value. If you've ever used the internet before, you've probably seen where people say something to the effect of, if your car is NA, you should run XYZ air fuel ratio, and people will take that number to the grave with them and run with that exact same number for the next 20 years and never even try anything different. And yes, you can replace the terminology air fuel ratio with Lambda if that makes you happier. So just last week, I had a car on the dyno that had 2 different brand widebands in it. little bit weird, but I've seen weirder. But ultimately, both of these air fuel monitors were installed in the same header and the same tube that were basically like right next to each other. I think it's as good of a job as you could do is trying to get the same reading from both. And they read significantly different. One read about 12.2 full throttle and the other one read 12.8 full throttle. So one, you could see how that could be extremely dangerous if this was on a turbo car and you think you're running one air fuel ratio, but you're actually running something significantly leaner. And two is if you just picked one air fuel ratio and ran with it, assuming you only had one, wideband in the car, and you didn't test any of the other air fuel ratios, you might not actually even be running the air fuel value that you think that you need to in order to get to max power. I also have a customer who has a naturally aspirated dirt track car, and for some reason, this car makes peak power at 11.5 air fuel ratio, again, naturally aspirated. And if you lean it out, it loses power. And if you richen it up, it loses power. And I for sure thought that this was maybe like a wideband issue because we were using the wideband that was in his car. So I put a second wideband in it, one of mine. And sure enough, it read identical to the wideband that he had in the car. So this is just kind of an oddball example, but I've definitely seen this more times than I can count. So the moral of the story here is that you need to test multiple target air fuel ratio values the same way that you would test different ignition timing values. Otherwise, you could potentially be leaving a whole lot on the table as widebands read different cars, combos, whatever, like something completely different than the other one. You can always throw what the spark plug looks like into the mix. But again, at the end of the day, there is no magic target air fuel ratio. So try a bunch of them and see which one your particular combo likes the best. While we're on the topic of air fuel ratios, a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this one, and that's fine. But especially when you're new to tuning and you're just getting started and you're trying to learn, I genuinely think that closed loop does more harm than good. And just to be clear, I'm not referring to getting a car started and running the first time, letting closed loop, get you up and going so that you can take it somewhere to get tuned. I think that side of it is great. But I'm talking about as you're actively going through the tuning process and you just kind of don't really get a feel for what's doing what. And in a lot of cases, it can make you kind of run around and chase your tail. So when I was first learning to tune, closed loop really wasn't a thing, especially full throttle. There was some part throttle stuff, but it's nowhere near the same as it is today. So when you were making changes to a tune and there was literally no closed loop, the car might start running really bad. The car might start running great. It might fix one problem, but create another problem. And I felt it just really, it was frustrating, but it really helped you grasp what happens when I make this change and what happens when I make that change, as to where now, guys put all their closed loop and learn limits at 100%, and you can make basically any change within the software and the car still runs nearly identical because the closed loop's just spiking to 1,000,000,000%. So you just really don't get to have the same kind of cause and effect learning that you do if you were to just turn closed loop off altogether. Here is one of many computers worth of 100% open loop tunes that I've done over the years. There is a lot of other situational type of things where I feel closed loop does more harm than good, but that's kind of beyond what we're covering in this video. Like I said before, I do think that these aggressive and large closed loop rates and stuff are awesome for guys who are trying to get their car started for the first time or load them onto the trailer to go take them to go get tuned, all of that good stuff. But again, in my worthless opinion, I feel it really takes a lot of the feel out of learning how to tune. This one is, again, my opinion that probably won't be very popular, but it seems that any of the auto-tune related stuff always sounds great on paper, but in reality, it usually sucks, or at the very least makes things take far longer than just doing it, let's call it the less lazy way. Different ECUs call it different things and have different ways of doing it. Around here, most things are on Holley, in which case they use the learn table as kind of the method for self-tuning that can be applied to the main fuel table. And it's not that I'm opposed to it altogether. I do think it is a good way to get a quick overview if a tune is all the way out in left field without having to dig through a bunch of data logs. And it's a good way to capture where in the map somebody is driving and spending a bunch of their time. Or sometimes if you're trying to capture some data and you're just by yourself, it can make things easier. And then also if you send somebody some sort of a map and you tell them not to drive it hard, you can look at it and tell they've been ripping the thing to 9,000 1,000 RPM over and over again. So it definitely serves its purpose and has its advantages, but it's kind of what you do with that data after the fact is what will make or break your tune. If we move away from Holley, go to like something like HP tuners, they have the ability to do what they call histograms, which can actually be pretty cool because you can do a bunch of creative stuff and you can make custom histograms to display basically whatever you want, which is really, really nice. But the problem again becomes that people will try to just populate a histogram on either long-term and short-term fuel trims, or maybe just short-term, or maybe just long-term, whatever the case may be. Ultimately, they try and use those histograms the same way that Holley does their learn table, and they'll just apply the whole histogram to the main fuel table and totally destroy it. And then ultimately the fuel map looks like it was tuned by a blind guy on a pogo stick. I already said earlier that I'm not much of a computer guy, but I do feel like this auto-populating fuel map stuff shouldn't be all that difficult to make significantly better than it currently is. So who knows, maybe one day this will become better and more functional than it is. But kind of to this day, I don't know a single professional tuner that relies on any of this self-tuning, self-learning stuff. Everybody just does all of that programming manually. So 100 years ago, a friend of mine was using my dyno and another friend was doing the tuning. Everybody was all amped up because this thing was supposed to make a lot of power and is a long-term project, blah, blah, blah. However, even with the boost basically turned all the way down, the knock sensor was going crazy. It was pulling a bunch of timing, and none of us knew any better at the time. So we figured that since the knock sensor was telling us that it was knocking, all of the data looked like what you would expect given the situation. So everybody just kind of took it that something was actually wrong and the engine was actually knocking. So long story short, called it quits on the dyno. They went through the entire car top to bottom, tried different fuels, colder plugs, changed all sorts of stuff, spent a bunch of time, money, and basically did all of the stuff that you would try back then. And ultimately they ended up figuring out, I don't know, I'm guessing they probably went to just change the sensor itself to see if that was the problem. And turns out the knock sensor was just loose and it was just rattling in the block, causing all kinds of false knock. So this is an extreme example, but the moral of the story is that you can't always just trust the knock sensor. I've seen them read false knock like this, and I've seen them read completely clean when the engine is clearly knocking its ass off. Especially with aftermarket ECUs, you can't just assume because you have a knock sensor that what you see or don't see is real. You typically need to configure all of that stuff and set it up and introduce knock in a safe way to verify that everything is working properly. So between the guys that are relying on the self-tuning for fuel tuning and then thinking that the knock sensor is going to take care of all of the timing, at that point, you know, what's the point of even really having a programmable ECU? I think the big takeaway with knock sensors is if you don't know how to program a knock sensor, I wouldn't encourage you to use the knock sensor for the tuning to be able to tell, you know, when the engine actually is or isn't knocking. You kind of would think as a beginner that the knock sensor would let you know when the engine is knocking to help kind of dial in the timing, but I feel like it's almost the other way around. You almost have to kind of have a handle on what the timing is and what knock works, when and where, and then you program the knock sensor after the fact, and then now that becomes your safety net for when things change after the tuning is completed. It'd be nice if it was, but it's not really like having a built-in dyno into the computer that tells you the optimum point for the ignition timing. It might be the case on some of the OEM ECU stuff because it's already been programmed that way, but once you get into the aftermarket stuff, is usually a good bit different. I would have thought by now that this would be more common knowledge, but I have learned that it absolutely is not. So hopefully this will help somebody out. Not sure how to really word this one, so we'll just go with dyno numbers can be misleading, or not all dynos read the same. Back when I was getting started with all this tuning stuff, a friend of mine who had been doing it a good bit longer than me, and he's way smarter than I am, and it always seemed that everything that he touched made 50, 100, even more horsepower than whatever it was that I was working on that, you know, had similar parts, similar combos or whatever. And I used to always wonder what in the hell I was doing wrong. Back then, it seemed like only a few different brands of dynos. Basically everybody, I think, but him that I knew, everybody had a dyno jet. But over time, you learn that not all dynos read the same. So I spent all this time just being stressed out, thinking that I sucked, just to figure out that his dyno was very generous compared to mine. Years later, I was running a shop that had a Mustang dyno in it, and this was after I had been using a dynojet for many years beforehand. So cars that would make 500 horsepower on my dynojet would make about 350 on this Mustang dyno, and that's obviously a huge difference. So knowing that this dyno read so much lower, before I would start tuning a car, I would have a conversation with the owner explaining that this dyno reads really low, and I'd kind of give them ranges of like, it should make this kind of power on a dynojet, so expect to see it make this kind of power on this dyno. And it never failed. They would always say that they understood that the concept of this dyno is going to read lower, but almost every time whenever we were done with the tuning, they would always be disappointed with the numbers, even though I kind of told them ahead of time what to expect and what the equivalent would be on a dynojet. And at one point we even built a math channel in the Mustang dyno software to show like roughly what the dynojet numbers would be. But like I said, everyone said that they understood, but at the end they'd be super disappointed, and they would actually take their car somewhere else and they'd pay somebody else for another tune just to essentially get the dyno sheet that was on par with what we said the numbers would be if you just simply converted it to dynojet numbers. So I ultimately ended up getting so tired of explaining all this that I just went out and bought another dyno, even though I was running a shop that had a dyno in it. So again, long story short, make sure that you're comparing apples to apples when comparing dyno numbers. We didn't even get into the possibility of people, manipulating dyno numbers, which does happen all the time, but that's a completely different subject. On the topic of dynos, another thing that I've learned, whether it's me tuning or others using my dyno, is that when you try to chase dyno numbers, that's usually when you end up breaking stuff. I've been very fortunate to not break a lot of things when I'm tuning, but it feels like all of the exceptions to that have been when a car makes like, say, 991 horsepower or something like that, and you're trying to do whatever you can to get the car to break 1,000 or, kind of whatever milestone it is that you're trying to hit. Once a car quits making power easily, my advice is just to stop, especially if you're a beginner. I had a car years ago that the owner of the car wanted to make 800 horsepower. This was on front wheel drive Honda, when 800 horsepower back then was the equivalent of like 1,500 horsepower now. But he had crappy tires on the car on a roller dyno. It actually made 799 horsepower is what the dyno showed. It was probably making north of 900. It was just spinning so bad. But 799 wasn't good enough for him. He really wanted to see that 800 mark. Basically, we knew it was making the power, so we started going crazy trying to strap the car down to get it to, have more traction, to be able to show more of the power that it was actually making, and ultimately ended up breaking fourth gear in the transmission.
If it blows up, it blows up.
Super common on those cars. But what really stunk with that one is he drove the car to the dyno. Now it's broken. He lives 2 hours away, has no way of getting home. All of that for 1 horsepower. And again, the car was making way more power than that. So he just wasn't okay with accepting that it made a bunch of power, cost himself a bunch of extra money and a bunch of huge inconveniences. So again, chasing numbers is almost always just results in a bunch of headaches. On the topic of making power, back when I was getting started, I used to think that tuning high horsepower stuff was super hard or impressive, but what you learn is that they usually just have better parts and make way higher baseline numbers. So if the parts are good and you're not pushing the car to the limit of those parts, there really isn't much of a difference in tuning a 1,500 horsepower car or a 700 horsepower car. So don't get intimidated as the power goes up. Just be smart about it and make sure that it's built to handle more power than you're trying to make, and you're not running it at the ragged edge. Things can obviously go wrong, and the higher power level stuff, usually the faster and more catastrophic that happens, but the tuning itself really isn't much different. And to break that down into simpler terms, if you make 1,500 horsepower on a car that's built to withstand 2,500 horsepower, it's usually pretty uneventful. But if you try to make 400 horsepower on a car that can only withstand a maximum of 400 horsepower, it's probably going to have much higher odds that the engine or whatever is going to fail, since you're right on the ragged edge of what that setup can withstand. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not encourage beginners to just jump right into 3,000 horsepower cars, and I'm not discrediting those that work on the higher horsepower stuff. I still prefer the lower power stuff for numerous different reasons. Ultimately, like I said, what I'm getting at is, as long as the car is built to withstand the power levels, it's maybe not quite as different tuning the higher horsepower stuff as you might think. But with all of that being said, the windows for air can get smaller as the power level goes up. And more importantly, as the power levels go up, the quality of the build and making sure that everything on the build is correct becomes significantly more important. This one is so important. If you look at the wiring in your car or in somebody else's car and your gut tells you that this probably is not going to work out very well, that gut feeling is usually correct more often than not. Now, there's a big difference between pretty and functionally correct, but more often than not, when the wiring looks like a dumpster fire, the car is going to be a nightmare when it comes to tuning. And this kind of goes back to the tuning is 80% troubleshooting thing. Now, one thing I have noticed over the years is that everybody's perception on what good wiring is completely different. The wiring guys want to build something that NASA could certify to blast into outer space with, and others buy a $90 harness off of Timo and expect the world from it. Somebody that's into wiring is going to be quick to tell you that they spent 340 grand on crimpers, while the next guy buys butt connectors from Harbor Freight. Over the years, it has been pretty deadly consistent that the better looking and cleaner the wiring is, usually the better outcome the car has. And there is a little bit of a gray area here too, because sometimes you see guys that build these wiring boards with all of these cheap components. Each one of those connections is, potential failure point. And then at the same time, I don't think the average guy needs a $35,000 harness, in his $600 car. So there's a balance to it. But generally, if you look at it and you're like, oh my God, this wiring is atrocious, usually everything else about the car just seems to fight you top to bottom. So ironically, my first race car didn't start off as a race car, just like most people, a street car, and it just got more and more aggressive and ultimately turned into a race car. But between having 400 different setups in it and just adding wiring, this, that, the other, I got to a point I started having all these weird problems with the car. The wiring looked atrocious. So I ultimately ripped all the wiring out, rewired it, and every one of the problems that I was fighting, they all went away. And back then, the wiring surely wasn't pretty or beautiful, but it went from like an atrocious mess on the car that I first learned on, and then updating it and making it at least somewhat presentable. Again, fixed all of the kind of unexplainable problems that I was having at that point in time. So if this isn't you, you probably know somebody that fits into this category where they spend all of their time learning, reading up on, and studying a new skill that it is that they want to learn, but they spend zero or very little time actually applying that knowledge and practicing. I see this all the time with people who want to learn how to tune. They can tell you every technical thing that there is about every situation, but when you see a computer in their lap, they actually start just shitting razor blades and can't remember anything anymore because they don't have any hands-on experience with it. When I got my mainline dyno, the very first car that I ever put on the dyno was also the very first car that I ever did that had Holley EFI on it. And this particular car owner was basically horrified that he was going to blow it up. I guess he wasn't in a position to fix it if that was the case. So he was just adamant on making sure that everything was safe. And I'll never actually forget this. I had not been scared or nervous in a car on the dyno in an eternity, but once I kind of got the car up to speed and I was about to make the first pull, it kind of hit me all at once that I had never used this dyno. I've never used that software. I've never used the Holley software. And it was kind of like one of those what do I do? I don't know. I mean, it only lasted for a few seconds, but it was kind of one of those whoa, this is what most of those guys must feel like that I'm referring to. So after making a couple of pulls, everything went back to normal and I sort of felt like I was at home again. So if you're trying to learn this stuff, for every hour that you spend educating yourself, you need to spend an hour applying what it is that you learned. That's the only way to really get comfortable and to be able to start making educated decisions versus letting your emotions kind of take the wheel.
You still coming, bro?
When you're nervous or you're uncomfortable, it seems like 9 times out of 10, that's when you make the mistakes. So the more you can practice and actually apply the information that you're learning, the less likely all of that is to happen. So this one has been a little bit interesting to see and kind of learn from over the years, in the fact that not all platforms like the same thing. I think to an extent that is pretty obvious, but there are certain things where you would think that this crappier option has to work worse than this really nice, really maybe expensive option. Let me give you an example. So if you have a B-Series Honda on the dyno with a turbo kit with a log manifold, and you remove the log manifold and you install a tubular manifold, it's typically going to pick up 75 to 100 horsepower nearly every time. Now, if you take the same car with the log manifold on it and you put in a set of large aftermarket cams, it's going to lose 100 horsepower. So between the cams and the manifold choice, like at same boost level and everything, you can have, you know, almost like a 200 horsepower difference. It's like literally night and day. What was kind of interesting is if you switch from a log manifold to a tubular style manifold on most, say, LS based stuff, the engine just doesn't seem to care one way or the other. And even with a log style manifold, it seems that you can kind of run whatever camshaft you want and you don't run into all the same problems that you do with the Honda, for example. This one's a little bit of a extreme example, but you get the point. So you can take what you know about a previous platform that maybe you know a whole bunch about, and you can kind of use it as an educated guess on maybe a new platform that you've never really worked on before. It doesn't, I guess, always mean that what you learn from this platform is going to apply to that platform 100%.
I don't like that shit.
So ultimately, you can take what you know about one platform and you can use it as an educated guess on what a new platform may or may not like, but it's not going to be 100% accurate all of the time. So as I've had to learn the hard way a few times now, is you see a problem and you're like, I fixed this by doing, you know, this on this other platform. And just because you do the same thing to this new platform doesn't mean that you're going to have the same results. So definitely keep that in mind. It seems that most people get a project complete, you know, after it took 3 years to get to that point. They replace every single nut, bolt, bracket on the entire car. But for whatever reason, it seems that nobody ever just simply gets a new battery. They'll charge the old battery that's been sitting in the corner for 3 years until it starts the car, and then they assume that the alternator will handle the rest. So when you go to start tuning it, after about 3 starts, the battery's dead and it's a massive inconvenience. That one's a little bit more straightforward. If you haven't run into that one yet, you will. But the one that I'm referring to is, I haven't seen this happen a lot, but I've seen it happen several times. And the first time I came across this, it made me want to drive this car straight into a tree. This car would struggle to start, like it had a weak battery, but it actually would start. And once it was up and running, it seemed like it ran real inconsistent. And it just, when it ran bad, nothing made any sense. And this was a really long time ago. I fought with this car for days and days. It would idle perfect for 2 hours. And then all of a sudden out of the blue, it would just be super erratic and total mess. And it would, like, you could drive it and it would cruise just fine. And all of a sudden it would just start bucking like Bronco. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And kind of back, like I said at the beginning of this video, when you're new to this stuff, it's pretty easy to just assume that everything is in the laptop and the problem that you're having are a result of something that you're doing or not doing in the laptop. So for whatever reason, I just decided to put a new battery in this car, and I shit you not, all of the problems immediately went away. And yes, like during this whole process, the voltage with the car running was reading, you know, I don't remember what the number was, 13.8, 14.0, whatever. The alternator was absolutely working. The voltage read perfectly fine, but I just wasted what felt like an eternity of time trying to chase tune-related problems, or so I thought, and ultimately the problem ended up being resolved by just replacing the battery. If you're new to tuning, check out this video here so that you can avoid making these 10 common mistakes that beginner tuners typically make.